as we have been doing for over a year now, as we continue our study of the Bible chronologically, Lynn does such a great job leading us through that. I said to Terry and Stacy this morning as we were meeting, we started this last January. Lynn's original plan was to study the Bible chronologically in a year. Well, we haven't exactly fit it in a year, but that's okay. We've had good discussion. But I said this morning, I think today is either the fourth or fifth time I've filled in for Lynn in a year and a half's time. And I appreciate so much Lynn doing that and just how Lynn teaches. Lynn really does a great job. But again, he's on vacation today, and that's good. We wish him well, wish him a good trip back, but he'll be back next week to pick up. Where we're going to be at today, most of the time, if not all the time, is Acts 15 and 16. We might get into Galatians, where we list in the bulletin every week what we're going to be studying next week. The reading was for Acts 15, 16 in the book of Galatians, but I told Lynn I don't know whether I'll get to Galatians or not, and if we don't, we'll talk about it next week, and if we do, we'll talk about it today. I'm going to do something a little different today, and I don't know if it'll work out or not. We'll see. But I'm not going to do a whole lot of actual reading of Scripture. That's, again, one of the things I love about Lynn. Lynn comes up here. Lynn doesn't have any notes with him. He doesn't have anything on his phone. A lot of us would make notes on our phone. And Lynn will stand up here and talk and teach and be very knowledgeable the whole time. And I can't do that. I have to have notes, and I have to. But we're not necessarily going to read any Scripture today. We might read individual, but we're not going to read big chunks at once. But in Acts chapter 15, we got to first of all look at the end of Acts 14. Paul and Barnabas are in Antioch, and they've been there about a year, give or take, and they've been teaching. And again, I'm not just going to read large chunks, but we're going to start. If you start at the very beginning of chapter 15, it says, "But some men came down from Judea and were teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved." Well, as we read on, as we go on through, again, verse 1 says some men, but I think as we get into this reading and as we get into talking about the council that met at Jerusalem in a little bit, we can probably guess or assume that they were Pharisees, or if not, at least they thought the same way the Pharisees thought. But I find it interesting, it says that they were teaching the brothers. You know, it appears, if they were Pharisees, it appears that they had accepted that Gentiles could become their Christian brothers, that maybe Gentiles were their Christian brothers, which would be a huge step for any Jew to accept that they were on the same level or could be on the same level as Gentiles. And some of the things I'm going to say here in the next minute or two, they're my opinion. This isn't. I think it's very possible that these men, whether they were Pharisees or not, that were teaching this, I think it's possible that they were truly sincere. That they thought that that's what had to happen. That they thought that you had to completely obey the old law, that you had to become a Jew in order to be a Christian. We're not told anywhere in this that they were doing this with malice or that they were doing this with some other intention that wasn't so good. I think we can take from this that this is what they thought. And again, they were sincere. The problem is what they were teaching. They were teaching, unless you're circumcised, you can't be saved. Now, all the things we've read to this point and the things that we know from studying the Bible over the years, the Gentiles had gladly received what Paul had been teaching them, what Peter taught them when Peter went to see the centurion. the words, they received it gladly, and there's a lot of those type of descriptions. They had accepted this, and they were running with it, and they were excited. Well, if you had people coming and telling you, hey, look, you've done okay, but you got to do this or you can't be saved, you think that might be disheartening? You think maybe that might have deflated the Gentiles a little bit? So, again, I think it's very possible that these men meant well, but they were doing damage. And as I was thinking about this, I think we see the same thing today. I think there are people in the world that they're sincere, they want to help other people, they want to try to, quote unquote, lead people to Christ or to God. They're just teaching things that are wrong. And I think we have to be careful about that. And I guess in a nutshell, we can have pure motives, but still be doing things incorrectly. Now, as we go on down, I find it interesting. I enjoy a play on words sometimes, but, verse 2 says that Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and debate with them. Now, when I read no small dissension and debate, I'm going to guess that was probably some pretty interesting conversation and probably maybe even some heated debate and discussion. But just very quickly, what I want to point out about that, at the end of the day, how did they settle it? Again, let's say for argument's sake that they had a huge argument about this. How did they settle it? Hey, you know what? We need to go down to Jerusalem, and we need to meet with the elders and the people there, and we need to figure out what's right and what's wrong. Yeah, Gary says that the New American Standard uses the word argument. I didn't look up different. I'm sure argument is in several different versions. But, you look at the world today, and I try really hard not to make political commentary up here because that's not what's important and not what we're here for. But in our world today, you've either got to be one or the other. You've either got to be left or right. You've either got to be Democrat or Republican. You either agree with me or you disagree with me. And if you agree with me, great. And if you disagree with me, you're just wrong. In our world, we don't have any middle anymore. We don't have any common ground. We can't have any debate, dissension, or even arguments, but where at the end of the day we come up to an agreement, well, hey, let's figure this out this way. Again, very interesting to me how they settled that, and we're gonna see that again. Verse 3 and 4 says, so they decide they're going to go down to Jerusalem, and they go, and as they're going through the towns in Phoenicia, Samaria, and they detail and they talk about all the work they've done, the people they've converted. Some really great words in here, some really good words in here. It says it was received with great joy when Paul and Barnabas and the other men with them, when they got to Jerusalem. It says they were welcomed by the church, by the apostles, and by the elders. Now, at this point, we're probably 10, maybe even as much as 15 years since Paul's conversion. We talked about Paul's conversion when I taught 2 weeks ago. Is that a little bit of a change in attitude? How did a lot of the members of the church and a lot of the church leaders in Jerusalem, what did they have to say about Paul when he was first converted? Gary says they feared him. That's a word they definitely used. At a minimum, they were skeptical, and they were very concerned. So to me, what a change in attitude in 10 or 15 years. What do you guys think maybe caused that change? Gary says his works. They see what They see what he'd done in 10 or 15 years. They see how sincere Paul was. So again, we get to verse 5. But some believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees rose up and said, "It is necessary to circumcise them and to order them to keep the law of Moses." Well, again, it doesn't say all Pharisees, but it says some Pharisees. And I find the wording there really interesting. To order them to keep the law of Moses. Not to recommend, not to say, hey, this is a good idea, but to order them. Like I said a few minutes ago, I think they meant well. I think they were sincere. But I think they were holding on to tradition. I think they were holding on to what they'd been taught. Sometimes it's hard to accept that what we've been taught all our life might not be correct. It's hard to accept that what we've been doing, what we believe, what our parents believed, what our grandparents believed, isn't correct anymore. One of the interesting notes I made, and again, Lynn does a really good job of not looking forward, and we're not going to do that today either. But if you really think about it, if you really kind of boil it away, what we're talking about when we talk about holding on to tradition, when we talk about the old law versus the new law, it's what the entire book of Hebrews is about. The entire book of Hebrews, whoever wrote it, Paul may have, but we don't know that for sure, Barnabas may have, is basically explaining to Jewish Christians why they've got to let go of all those old teachings, old customs, old feasts, old ceremonies, because Christ is better. So again, this isn't a problem that just came up here 10, 15 years after Christ was gone. I find it interesting. Verses 7, 8, 9, Peter stands up. "Brothers, you know that in the early days God made a choice among you that by my mouth the Gentiles should hear the word of the gospel and believe. And God, who knows the heart, bore witness to them by giving them the Holy Spirit just as he did to us. And he made no distinction between us and them, having cleansed their hearts by faith. Now therefore, why are you putting God to the test by placing a yoke on the neck of the disciples that neither our fathers nor we have been able to bear? But we believe that we will be saved through the grace of the Lord Jesus, just as they will." Peter stands up. Peter was never one to kind of fade back into the background. Peter wasn't afraid to speak, probably was too rash at times, spoke too much at times. But Peter makes a couple of just what I think are great points. In verse 9, he says there's no distinction. God doesn't distinguish. He doesn't distinguish between Jew and Gentile. Paul talks later, he doesn't distinguish between slave and free. He doesn't distinguish between male and female. He doesn't distinguish between circumcised and uncircumcised. These are my words now. He doesn't distinguish between rich and poor. While this is not an issue anymore, 50 or 60 years ago in this area, this was probably a little bit of an issue. He doesn't distinguish between black and white, or Chinese, or European, or Australian. There is no distinction. We're all the same. We all have access to the same grace through Jesus Christ. I hesitate to say we're all the same. That's not exactly the right way to say it, because there are some things in the Bible later on that we'll get to, that things that men are called to do, things that women are called to do. But we all have the same access. We are all children of God. And I love, too, Peter, again, verse 10. Why are you trying to put this weight on these Gentile converts? Why are you trying to put this yoke on them, this burden on them? What you're trying to put on them, we can't even do it successfully. Our fathers weren't able to do it. You guys are talking about all this tradition. You guys are talking about all these things that they've got to do to become a Jew and then by extension become a Christian. We can't even do that. To put that in maybe a little more simpler terms, what Paul's telling them is, you guys think being a Jew is a big deal. You guys can't even be a Jew. You guys can't even keep these laws. I love that response. Again, Peter very succinct about it. Not going to read verses 13 to 19, but that's where James stands up. And it's obvious at this point that James had a huge role in the church and was held in very high esteem because what he had to say, people very much listened to. But he reminds these same Pharisees that the Old Testament foretells the addition of Gentiles in God's plan. Now, he recites, or at least in Luke's recording of what he said, he recites a passage from Amos. But as I look through this, there are references, and the terminology in most of these are either all nations or foreign nations. There's references in Genesis. There's references in Genesis 22, 26, 28. There's references in Isaiah 49, 55, Zephaniah 3, Zechariah 8. There are multiple references in the Old Testament where these foreign nations or all nations are going to be brought in to be children of God. So again, I love how James doesn't stand up and say, you know what? Paul's been out here doing all this work. Paul's converted all these Gentiles, and I think he's right. If you're being the arbiter of a dispute, of a discussion, the best argument you can make, the best point you can make is not, well, I just think Brad's right. James very smartly uses the very things that the Pharisees were hanging on to. He uses the Old Testament to go back and say, this is obviously right because here it is. It's been written. This isn't anything new. Then you go right into verse 20, and he says, but we should write to them to abstain from the things polluted by idols, and from sexual immorality, and from what has been strangled, and from blood. For from ancient generations Moses has had in every city those who proclaim him, for he is read every Sabbath in the synagogues. Well, you look at this and it can be kind of, we've just gone through about 15, 16 verses where Peter, and kind of by extension Paul early on, and James say, guys, there's no distinction. You don't have to be a Jew. You don't have to be circumcised. We're not following the old law anymore. And then here in verse 20, James turns right around and says, but we're going to write to them to abstain from these things, which followed Mosaic teaching. Well, at first blush, that can almost be a contradiction. Well, didn't we just get done reading that they're the same? We don't treat them any different? But I really think if we get into this and we spend a few minutes on this, we can understand this. First of all of these things but sexual immorality are dietary restrictions. The Jews were forbidden to eat, and James is reinforcing you can't eat eat meat that's been offered to idols, and that was a Gentile custom. The restrictions to the way meat was prepared, that there wasn't blood, things that had been strangled. So these are all dietary restrictions. But I think the wording there, abstain from, it doesn't say you absolutely cannot do these things. It says to abstain from them. Now again, speaking of contradictions, I just said a minute ago I'm not going to talk about politics. Well, I'm going to talk about politics for a second. For those of you that don't know, and many of you probably don't, I'm a county commissioner here in Putnam County. When we have a county commission meeting and we vote on things that come before the commission, occasionally, because of my daytime job, there are things related to my daytime job that come before the commission. Anytime they come before the commission, when it comes time to vote, I abstain from that. I abstain from that because by me voting yes or no, as the case may be, that could appear to be some impropriety. That could appear, the appearance could be that my vote is influenced on my day job. So I abstain. The law doesn't require me to abstain. Morally, well, let me rephrase that. Legally, I could vote yes or I could vote no and be perfectly fine. But morally, again, to stay away from the appearance of any impropriety, I abstain. And I think that's the word, the usage here is the same thing. James isn't forcing the law of Moses on the Gentiles here. But from a practical matter, he's saying, look, you're going to be around Jews all the time. And if you want to fit in, and if you want to not have dissension, and if we want to spread the gospel, don't do these things. Don't eat meat that's been presented to an idol or meat that hasn't been properly, because you're going to offend them. In fact, that would be very offensive. So just don't do it. Again, to me, abstain from is a little different than absolutely positively under no circumstances do this. But I think we can see here this isn't a contradiction in saying, well, they're not under the Mosaic law, and then, oh, by the way, guys, do this. I think it's a reminder, a firm reminder, but strong. If you do these things, you're going to insult, you're going to offend your Jewish brothers, and we don't want to do that. Now, a couple of quick points for us today. We need to always be conscious of what our actions, or sometimes what our inactions, show other people and how they influence other people. There are things that we probably don't realize sometimes that when we do them, that it may negatively influence somebody, or it may positively influence somebody. But again, we need to try to be conscious of what we do and the potential influence that we might have. The last thing I said here, just because something is legal, just because something is okay, doesn't mean it's the best thing to do. Doesn't mean it's the proper thing to do. Gary says, for sure, not in today's society. Absolutely. There are a lot of things that are legal today that a good Christian probably doesn't need to have any business with. Towards the end of the chapter, down verses 36 and 40, Paul and Barnabas, they start talking about that they're going to go back and they're going to visit everybody they visited, all the cities they've seen. And Barnabas wants to take Mark. And Paul didn't want to take Mark. Apparently Mark had been with them at an earlier time and had left unexpectedly. And so again, they had a disagreement about this. Well, my question, back to the same question I had earlier. How'd they settle this disagreement? Well, if we can't all agree and we can't all be together, I tell you what, Barnabas, you and Mark go this way. Silas and I are going to go this way. They didn't quit the church. They didn't go around that we are aware of. This certainly isn't recorded if it was the case. They didn't go around bad-mouthing one another. They didn't go around talking about that stupid Barnabas, why is he taking Mark? They separated and they continued to work. Now here's my question for you. If Paul had said, hey, you know what, yeah, it's okay, let's take Mark, and Paul and Barnabas and Mark and Silas had all gone together, would they have gotten as much done together? Would they have spread the gospel as much together as they probably ended up spreading the gospel with Barnabas and Mark going one way and Paul and Silas going the other? At the end of the day, two friends, two companions. Again, we talked 2 weeks ago about how much Barnabas took up for Paul early on. Two people that had to be very special to each other. At the end of the day, they had a little disagreement. They worked it out. And my statement to you is, the way they worked it out probably furthered the gospel. Again, I fear that today when we have disagreements, today when we're arguing about something, that the way we end up working it out doesn't further the gospel. Flip on over to chapter 16 here real quick. We've got a few minutes left, and we'll try to get through it again. I told Lynn early on, yeah, I can do 15 and 16 in the book of Galatians. And then Wednesday night I said, I'm not sure we'll get to Galatians, so that's okay. So at the beginning of chapter 16, Paul meets Timothy, a young man that was the son of a Jewish woman and a Greek man. Everybody there says, hey, this young man, he's a great young man. He's a good guy. And Paul wanted to take him with him. Paul wanted to have him as part of his party. And in verse 3, what does it say that he did? What did Paul do with Timothy? He took him and circumcised him. Well, all right, I'm getting confused again. Didn't we just talk about last chapter? Paul was one of the people arguing that the Greeks didn't need to be circumcised. So again, on the outwardly, just if you look at it from a far off point of view, well, here's another potential contradiction. But I don't think it was a contradiction. Nowhere does it say here that Paul was telling Timothy, if you don't let me circumcise you, you can't be saved. Nowhere does it tell us that Paul was basing Timothy's salvation in any way on whether he was being circumcised or not. Luke points out Timothy's mother was Jewish, his father was Greek. So, because his mother was a Jew, Timothy could be considered Jewish, could be considered a Jew. But because of the fact that he was uncircumcised, he would be considered in Jewish circles an apostate. So again, I think Paul's perspective here, Timothy, if you're going to be working with me, and I want you to work with me, and I want you to teach and preach, you don't need to offend your Jewish brothers. You need to be able to reach them. They need to know and not be offended, not be put off. And so the best thing is, the easiest way to do that is for you to be circumcised. And again, I think that's very different than saying your salvation rests on whether you become circumcised or not. So again, if we're making these decisions in a way that we don't offend other people, in a way that we can teach other people, that we can reach people better, then There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's a good decision. A couple of points here at the end. Again, we're running out of time. I find it interesting, starting in about Luke, in about verse 10, and through verse 16, we start seeing pronouns we, us, that weren't existing previously. So I'm no linguistic expert. In fact, I barely speak English. I'm a numbers guy. But when I see we and us, what does that mean? Luke's with them at this point. So Luke probably joined them at Troas, I think would be right. And I find it interesting that from all the way through those verses, he's using, again, we and us, but he doesn't mention Timothy. So it's interesting to me, Paul may, after he circumcised him, he may have sent Timothy off to teach somewhere else, or may have left Timothy to teach. But then we get down, and we're going to finish the chapter 17 through 40 here. Luke quits using we again, and Luke talks about Paul and Silas. So I have two thoughts there. It's very possible Luke had gone somewhere else at that point. Or I think it's possible Luke was just being modest and saying that what he's going to describe happened to Paul and Silas, and he didn't want any credit himself. But the rest of this chapter, there's a demon-possessed girl who the people that owned her, so you could say she was a slave, she could see into the future. She could prophesy. And they run into Paul and Silas, and she continually, in fact, it says it annoys Paul, depending on what version of the Bible you read, but it says that it annoyed Paul. But she keeps saying who Paul and Silas are and what they're doing. That these men are the servants of the Most High God who proclaim to you the way of salvation. I find it interesting here, depending on how you look through, what lens you look through. You know what this demon-possessed girl was really doing? She's verifying who they are. She's testifying to the divine credentials of Paul and Silas. So in one way, while her annoying Paul, while that causes them some other issues, she, at the end of the day, if you really look at it, she and the demon that possessed her through her were saying they are who they say they are. And this is how you get salvation. So anyway, I'm paraphrasing here. Paul says he became greatly annoyed, and he commanded that the demon come out of her, and the demon came out. She's of no use to these people that own her anymore, because they made money off of her ability, or the demon's ability, to prophesy. So they get mad. They take them before the magistrate. Verses 22 and 23 say that they're beaten with rods. And then they're jailed. And not only are they jailed, they're taken to the inner jail, and their feet are put in stocks. They're locked in stocks. Now, what I wrote out in parentheses here, they weren't put in county jail down here off the square. They were put in maximum security. They were locked up as you could be. The most secure way they could be locked up. So they've been beaten with rods. They've been locked up in the most secure prison, the most secure way they could be locked up. And what's verse 25 say they immediately started doing? Singing and praying. If that happened to me, I don't know that I'd be singing and praying. I know I'd be feeling sorry for myself, and I'd probably be moaning and groaning, and I wouldn't be happy. We know an earthquake comes, they're freed. The jailer's about to kill himself because he thinks everybody's escaped, and Paul says, hey, no, we're all here. And I find it really interesting when that happened. Look at verse 30. What's the jailer's response? What must I do to be saved? The jailer, A, obviously knew who Paul and Silas were and what they had been teaching. But B, this one action was convincing enough that it converted him. Very quickly, our time's up. They tell him to believe on the Lord Jesus. Believe what? Well, it says then that they spoke the word of the Lord to him, and it says, and again, I'm skipping some verses, but he was baptized at once, he and all his family. So, if he was baptized at once, he and all his family, what do you guys think they taught him when they taught him? You think they taught him baptism? They had to have, otherwise how would he know? And that reminds me back in Acts 7 of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. It says that Philip taught the eunuch, and then the eunuch says, here's water, what hinders me? Well, again, we have to infer from that they taught baptism. And my last point here, we're out of time. Verse 35, if you read this, basically at the end of the day, Paul and Silas willingly returned back to the prison. Again, that's faith. And I don't know that I would have that kind of faith. If they were going to be released the next day, because verse 35, they say that they come to release them. If they were going to be released the next day, why did God send the earthquake? Why did he cause the earthquake? How many people were converted? How many people were saved because of the earthquake? We'll stop there. Lynn will pick up again in Galatians and the reading that was listed this week. Appreciate your time. Appreciate your comments. Who's got our prayer?